I am Eleanor Montgomery, a 32-year-old interior designer who never imagined that a single call could incinerate my entire existence. The panicked voice of a neighbor explained that my father's historic Lexington farmhouse was being swallowed by uncontrollable flames during a violent storm. Driving through the flooded streets of Massachusetts felt like a terrifying nightmare as I pushed my car to dangerous speeds while the torrential rain blurred my vision. Upon arriving at Massachusetts General Hospital, the oppressive silence of the sterile emergency wing seemed to scream louder than the sirens I had heard earlier. A doctor with a weary expression approached me near the trauma unit, his heavy silence confirming my worst fears before he even opened his mouth. He placed a sympathetic hand on my shoulder while delivering the sentence that destroyed my entire world, saying, "We did everything we could." I stood completely paralyzed in that cold hallway as the medical staff began pushing the gurney toward the dark entrance of the hospital morgue. Just as they turned the corner, a small piece of crumpled paper slipped from under the white sheet, fluttering quietly onto the polished tile floor. I picked it up with trembling fingers, discovering a handwritten note mentioning 24 Beacon Street in Boston, with a strict warning to keep it secret from my brother. If so, you can witness the full revelation of this family secret. Before the fire actually consumed the farm, our family had already been smoldering from within because of Silas's greed. My brother Silas had spent several years chasing a hollow illusion of wealth through reckless virtual land speculation that eventually left him drowning in massive debt. He secretly wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars on digital properties with no real value while also losing significant amounts at the Springfield casinos. The financial situation became so dire that local loan sharks began calling our family home with veiled threats that kept my father awake throughout the night. Dad had always been a man of immense integrity who valued family loyalty far above his own long-term financial security. To save his only son from a violent end at the hands of those creditors, my father, Arthur Montgomery, made the heartbreaking decision to liquidate his entire retirement fund. He sold his cherished collection of vintage watches alongside his diversified stock portfolio just to keep the debt collectors away from our front door. Every single cent that he had carefully saved over 4 decades of hard work vanished into the bottomless pit of my brother's failures. Despite these massive sacrifices, the gratitude I expected from Silas never materialized because he continued to act like the entire world owed him everything. One particularly humid evening during the late summer, Silas suddenly appeared at the farm with an arrogant smirk that usually signaled fresh trouble. He sat down at the heavy oak dining table and demanded a cup of black coffee before looking Dad directly in the eye. Without a single word of appreciation for the previous bailouts, he brazenly asked for another $50,000 to fund what he called a guaranteed business opportunity. I sat across from him, feeling my blood boil while he talked about market trends, as our father's hands trembled with visible exhaustion. Silas spoke with such entitlement that it felt as if the money was just sitting in a drawer, waiting for him to pick it up for his next gamble. My father took a deep breath before slowly setting his glasses down on the table to face the son who had disappointed him so many times. He spoke with a quiet but unbreakable firmness when he explained that there was absolutely no money left in his bank accounts to give away. Dad looked Silas in the eye and said, "There is no more money for your destructive habits because every available asset has already been sacrificed to pay for your mistakes." He stated that he would no longer enable a lifestyle of total destruction that was clearly tearing our family apart while we all suffered for his greed. It was the first time I had ever seen my father stand his ground so completely against the son he once adored. The rejection caused something inside Silas to snap as he stood up so violently that his heavy chair nearly tipped over onto the floor. His face turned a deep shade of crimson while he began shouting about how Dad was allegedly hoarding the remaining inheritance for my future. He accused our father of favoring my career in Boston over his entrepreneurial dreams, despite the fact that I had never asked for a dime. Silas spat out words of pure jealousy and hatred, claiming that we were both conspiring to leave him with nothing while we lived in luxury. His insults toward Dad were so personal and cruel that the air in the room felt thick with a sudden, sharp hostility. I could not sit there in silence any longer while my ungrateful brother berated a man who had given up his entire future to save him. I stood up and said, "Your behavior is beyond disgusting, and you need to leave this property immediately before the situation escalates further." Silas glared at me with a look of genuine malice before grabbing his coat and storming out into the darkness of the yard. That night, the invisible bond that once held us together as siblings was severed forever under the weight of his absolute ungratefulness. 1 week before the fire turned our lives into ash, I decided to drive back to the farm without calling ahead, just to spend some quality time with my beloved father. As I stepped onto the familiar creaking floorboards of the mudroom, the violent sound of Silas's voice echoing from the kitchen immediately shattered my hopes for a quiet weekend. I stood frozen for a moment while I heard him slamming a heavy folder onto the wooden table while demanding that Dad sign a legal authorization to sell our ancestral apple orchard. Silas was shouting about how the land was just a liability and how he needed the capital immediately to cover his failing real estate ventures. The sheer desperation in his voice made me realize that his financial situation was far more dangerous than he had ever admitted to the family before. I pushed the kitchen door open and saw my father sitting slumped in his chair while his hands covered his face in a gesture of absolute defeat. Silas was looming over him with a pen in his hand, his eyes wild with a mixture of greed and panic that turned my stomach. I walked directly between them and grabbed the legal documents off the table before my brother could react to my sudden presence in the room. I looked Silas directly in the eye and told him, "You need to get out of this house right now if you think you can continue bullying a man who has already given you everything he owns." He tried to snatch the papers back, but I held them firmly away while my father looked up with a mixture of relief and profound sadness in his eyes. The argument that followed was the most explosive confrontation we had ever experienced, because Silas had completely abandoned any pretense of familial affection or basic human decency. He accused me of being a judgmental outsider who didn't understand the pressures of the business world or the reality of his mounting debts. The tension in the small kitchen was so thick that it felt like the air itself was about to ignite into a physical flame. Eventually, Silas realized that he would not be getting his way that day, and he began backing toward the exit while pointing a shaking finger at both of us. He paused at the doorway and spat out a chilling warning that stayed with me for a long time afterward, saying, "You will both regret treating me like a stranger in my own home because I am done playing nice with people who want to see me fail." The sound of his car tires screaming against the gravel driveway eventually faded away into the heavy silence of the rural evening as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Dad and I walked out to the wide wooden porch and sat in our favorite rocking chairs while watching the orange light wash over the rows of ripening apple trees. He seemed to have aged 10 years in a single hour, and he sighed deeply while rubbing his tired eyes with the back of his weathered hands. He turned to me and whispered, "It breaks my heart to see the boy I raised turn into someone I don't even recognize anymore, because it feels like his humanity has been completely consumed by greed." We sat there for a long time without speaking while the crickets began their nightly chorus in the tall grass surrounding the farmhouse. Just before the last of the light disappeared, Dad leaned over and placed his warm hand on mine with a look of intense seriousness that I had rarely seen before. He spoke in a low voice about a backup plan he had secretly arranged at a law office in Boston to ensure that our family legacy and assets would remain protected regardless of what happened next. He told me that there were certain documents kept in a secure location on Beacon Street that would prevent Silas from ever destroying what our ancestors had built through generations of hard work. "I have made sure that your future is safe if things ever go wrong here, so promise me you will look for the signs I have left behind," he said while looking toward the darkened orchard with a sense of grim determination. I didn't fully understand the weight of his words at the time, because I was too focused on the emotional aftermath of the confrontation with my brother. We spent the rest of the evening talking about simple things like the upcoming harvest and the repairs needed for the old barn, as if the world was still a safe place. Those few hours of quiet conversation felt like a precious gift of peace that I would carry with me through the emotional storm that was about to arrive. We watched the stars come out over the hills of Lexington and shared a final cup of tea, while the house felt warmer and more secure than it had in months. It was the last time I would ever see his kind smile or hear his comforting voice before the horrific tragedy struck our family exactly 7 days later. That beautiful morning began with warm rays of autumn sunshine illuminating my design studio before the shrill ring of my cell phone suddenly shattered the peaceful atmosphere. I answered the call to hear the frantic voice of my father's closest neighbor, describing the massive plumes of black smoke that were currently rising from our historic property in Lexington. I abandoned my project, driving toward the countryside with a racing heart, while my mind refused to process the possibility that our family legacy was being destroyed. When I finally reached the end of the gravel road, the sight of the charred remains of our ancestral farmhouse literally took my breath away in the most painful manner imaginable. Where the grand white wooden porch used to stand there was now only a skeletal frame of blackened timber surrounded by the persistent hiss of water hitting red-hot embers. Several fire crews were still working tirelessly to extinguish the final pockets of flames that were clinging to the ruins of the place I had called home for my entire life. A police officer with soot covering his uniform approached my car, holding my shoulders firmly to prevent me from running into the dangerous debris of the smoldering structure. He spoke with a somber tone when he explained that Dad had been found unconscious near the heavy safe in his burning study while trying to salvage some important documents. The officer told me that the medical team had already transported him to the city hospital in critical condition due to severe smoke inhalation and extensive third-degree burns. My heart pounded against my ribs as I realized that the man who had always been my protector was now fighting for his survival because of this inexplicable disaster. I jumped back into my car, driving toward the city in a state of semi-consciousness, while begging every higher power for a miracle that would return him to me. Upon arriving at the emergency department of Massachusetts General Hospital, I saw Silas pacing near the entrance with a look of frantic calculation rather than the genuine grief a son should feel. He immediately intercepted me, grabbing my arm with a strength that felt intrusive, his eyes scanning my clothes and purse to see if I had salvaged anything from the wreckage. Silas whispered into my ear with a voice that lacked any real emotional warmth, asking, "Did you manage to locate the master key to the study safe, or any of the insurance binders before the structure was completely lost?" I pulled away from his grip with a surge of pure disgust, because his primary concern was the financial paper trail instead of the life of the man currently lying in the trauma unit. My brother continued to pretend to be devastated whenever a nurse walked past us, but his true focus remained on the potential loss of his future inheritance. My best friend Lydia arrived shortly afterward, sitting beside me in the waiting room while offering a silent strength that kept me from collapsing under the weight of my anxiety. She held my hand firmly and whispered, "You have to stay strong for Eleanor, because your father has always been a fighter who never gives up on the people he loves." We sat in that sterile hallway for what felt like several hours, while the muffled sounds of medical machinery and quiet footsteps echoed through the oppressive air. Silas stayed on the opposite side of the room, constantly checking his phone and avoiding any direct eye contact with me during our agonizing wait for news. The double doors of the trauma center finally opened, and a senior physician with a weary expression walked toward us with slow and deliberate steps that made my blood run cold. He stopped directly in front of me, delivering the news that Arthur Montgomery had succumbed to his internal injuries, despite their best efforts to stabilize his breathing. I felt as though the floor beneath my feet had completely disappeared, while the world around me dissolved into a blur of gray light and muffled voices. The doctor looked at my paralyzed expression and said, We did everything we could to save him, but the damage to his lungs was far too severe for his heart to continue beating. I stood there in total shock, as the reality of losing my only true ally and my childhood home in a single day became an unbearable burden. My heart was shattered into 1,000 pieces while I struggled to breathe in the suffocating silence of the hospital hallway, realizing that I was now truly alone against my brother's greed. As the medical attendants pushed the gurney carrying my father's body away until it vanished behind the heavy silver doors of the morgue, that small scrap of paper felt like an invisible hand holding me back from the abyss of my grief. I moved quickly into a shadowed corner of the hospital hallway to unfold the crumpled note with hands that would not stop shaking, despite my best efforts to maintain a calm exterior. The shaky words were written in my father's distinctive but rushed handwriting, and they clearly stated an address at 24 Beacon Street in Boston, followed by a desperate warning to never let Silas know about its existence. An icy shiver raced down my spine as the terrifying realization dawned on me that Dad had actually anticipated this horrific tragedy and had spent his final days preparing a secret path for me to discover the hidden truth. He must have known that his own son was capable of something truly monstrous, because the specific instructions were clearly meant to keep this vital information out of my brother's greedy reach. I looked across the crowded waiting room and saw Silas engaged in an animated conversation with a man who looked like a legal consultant, his face devoid of any genuine mourning as he gestured toward a stack of medical forms. This was my only chance to disappear before he noticed my sudden absence, so I quietly slipped through the side exit and walked toward the parking garage while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached my vehicle and immediately disabled the global positioning system on my phone because I knew that Silas would try to track my every movement the moment he realized I was no longer under his control. The flickering city lights of Boston seemed to blur together as I drove away from the hospital, feeling like a fugitive in my own life while carrying the weight of a secret that could destroy what remained of our family. I needed to find a safe place to process this information, and there was only one person in this world who would never betray my confidence in such a dangerous situation. I met Lydia at a secluded cafe on the outskirts of the city, where the dim lighting provided the perfect cover for our clandestine meeting to discuss the suspicious circumstances surrounding the fire. She looked at the note I placed on the table, and her eyes widened with a mixture of intense concern as she accessed the private public records she managed for her corporate firm. I looked directly into her concerned eyes with a sense of desperation and said, "Lydia, I need you to look into the insurance history of the Montgomery farm because I have a sickening feeling that the fire was not an accident." She nodded solemnly and began typing rapidly on her tablet, while the only sound in our small booth was the steady hum of her device and the distant clinking of coffee cups. After a few minutes of intense searching through the digital archives, she turned the screen toward me and pointed to a series of unusual financial transactions that had taken place very recently. The digital records clearly showed that Silas had secretly authorized a massive increase in the fire insurance compensation for the property just 14 days before the farmhouse was reduced to a pile of black ashes. Lydia leaned across the table and whispered in a low tone, "Eleanor, your brother was literally betting on the house burning down, and he made sure the payout would be large enough to cover his massive gambling debts." I felt a wave of cold nausea wash over me as the evidence of his calculated betrayal became impossible to ignore, confirming my father's deepest fears about his own son's morality. It was now undeniable that Silas had a significant financial motive for the tragedy, and his recent behavior at the hospital made perfect sense in light of this shocking discovery about his secret activities. I realized that the address on Beacon Street was likely the only thing standing between Silas and the total destruction of our family's honor, and I would not let him win this game. I spent the next hour discussing the potential legal implications with Lydia, while we sat in that quiet booth making a solemn vow to keep our investigation hidden until the proper time for a public confrontation. She looked at me with a determined expression and said, "You must attend the funeral and act as though you know nothing, because Silas will be watching you for any sign of hidden knowledge or suspicion." I took a deep breath and promised her that I would endure the upcoming memorial service with a stoic face before heading directly to the mysterious address in Boston to meet the person my father had trusted. The determination to seek justice for Arthur Montgomery began to replace my overwhelming grief, providing me with a sense of purpose that I had never felt before in my life. I drove home in the dark, clutching the steering wheel with a renewed sense of strength and knowing that the battle for our family's heritage had only just begun. That morning, Dad's funeral took place under the gray skies of Lexington, where the artificial sounds of Silas's wailing echoed through the graveyard in a way that felt truly disgusting to my ears. I watched him through narrowed eyes, noticing how he frequently adjusted his position to ensure he remained the center of everyone's sympathy, while the priest delivered the final prayer. The local farmers and shopkeepers looked at him with genuine pity, unaware of the serpent hiding behind the expensive black suit and the polished shoes he wore for the occasion. During a brief moment of silence, I spotted him leaning toward a man wearing an expensive charcoal suit who was standing at the very edge of the cemetery trees. They were exchanging hushed words and several intense glances that had absolutely nothing to do with mourning a lost parent or honoring a long and honorable life. Silas even managed to slip a small business card into his pocket before turning back to the crowd with a fresh wave of performative tears that made my stomach churn with a mixture of anger and disbelief. It was clear to me that even while the soil was still being moved, he was already negotiating the price of the ground we were standing upon. Immediately after the service concluded and the last of the mourners had offered their condolences, Silas called for a brief family meeting to take place at the ruins of the farmhouse. We stood amidst the charred remains of the place where we had grown up, surrounded by the smell of wet soot and the skeletal structures of what used to be a warm and welcoming home. He did not waste a single second on sentimentality as he reached into his briefcase to pull out several folders filled with legal-looking documents and property maps. He looked at me with a cold and calculating expression, his voice shifting into a tone of absolute authority that signaled the end of any remaining family unity. Silas declared that since he was the eldest son, he was the sole legal heir of the Montgomery estate, according to the outdated documents he claimed to possess. He stated with a chilling lack of emotion, "I am the only legal heir under the traditional laws of inheritance, and this land will be sold to the highest bidder by the end of the week." I felt a surge of protective rage for my father's memory as I listened to him talk about our heritage, as if it were nothing more than a series of numbers on a balance sheet. I stepped forward and told him, "This farm has been in our family for 4 generations, and I will not stand by while you destroy everything Dad loved for a quick payout." Silas did not even blink at my protest, instead, letting out a sharp and mocking laugh that echoed through the hollowed-out remains of our childhood kitchen. He stepped closer to me, his eyes filled with a predatory gleam that made me realize he had probably been planning this move for several months. He looked at me with pure contempt and said, "You are nothing more than a guest on my property now, so I suggest you pack your bags and get out before I have the police remove you." The sheer cruelty and absolute greed in his words made me understand that any invisible bond we once shared as siblings had been severed beyond any possibility of repair. I realized in that moment that Silas was no longer my brother, but a dangerous enemy who would stop at nothing to satisfy his insatiable hunger for money. The air between us was thick with a sudden and irreversible hostility that confirmed my decision to follow my father's secret instructions without any further hesitation. I spent the remainder of the evening moving through the parts of the property that were still accessible, gathering the few precious mementos that had survived the heat of the fire. Under the cover of a moonless night, I loaded my few belongings into my car, while the silhouette of the ruined house stood like a dark sentinel against the starry sky. I felt a renewed sense of strength as I began the long drive toward the bright lights of central Boston, with the crumpled note still safely tucked in my pocket. Every mile that put distance between me and the farm brought a greater sense of clarity about the battle that was waiting for me at 24 Beacon Street. I was no longer just a grieving daughter but the chosen guardian of a legacy that Silas would never be allowed to touch with his filthy hands. The city lights began to appear on the horizon as I pushed the car faster toward my father's final hope for justice. At exactly 8 in the morning in central Boston, I stood before the ancient building at number 24 Beacon Street as the city began its frantic rhythm of life. The towering brick structure seemed to watch me with an air of historical authority, while my heart pounded with a mixture of terror and hope. I navigated the quiet lobby and took the elevator to the 4th floor, eventually stopping in front of a set of heavy mahogany doors that bore a small brass nameplate. Theodore Vance was waiting for me inside his private office, his sharp eyes reflecting a deep sense of shared sorrow as he stood up to greet me. He was a man who had practiced law with my father for decades, and he knew the Montgomery family secrets better than anyone else in the state. Theodore took my trembling hands in his own while ushering me toward a secluded conference room that smelled of old parchment and expensive tobacco. He whispered that he had been waiting for this moment since the news of the Lexington tragedy reached his desk 3 days ago. We sat down across a polished wooden table while he began to unfold the complex plan my father had carefully constructed to protect our family legacy. Theodore revealed that exactly 1 month before the fire, Dad had made a secret trip to Boston to rewrite his entire will from scratch. My father had grown increasingly suspicious of his son's behavior, and he wanted to ensure that the farm remained in safe hands regardless of the cost. He understood the legal system perfectly because of his years on the bench, and he knew exactly how Silas would try to manipulate the inheritance laws. The lawyer reached into a heavy steel safe and produced the original document that bore my father's bold and unmistakable signature, alongside an official state seal. Theodore looked at me with a grim smile and said, "Arthur created a legal trap by leaving a fake draft in his study that would lead Silas to believe he was the sole heir. This brilliant move was designed to force Silas to reveal his greed and provide the proof we needed to challenge his claims in a public court. The actual will was a masterpiece of protective legislation that left the entire Montgomery estate and all its liquid assets directly to me as the sole beneficiary. Silas was only allocated a specific amount of money that would be transferred directly to his creditors to settle his outstanding bank debts. Dad had intentionally prevented his son from receiving a single dollar of cash that could be used to fund his destructive gambling habits or real estate scams. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I realized that our ancestral home was now legally protected by my father's foresight and love. Theodore then turned on a small digital recorder that sat between us on the table, filling the room with the aggressive sound of my brother's voice. Silas was shouting into the phone, his tone dripping with a terrifying mixture of desperation and cold malice as he demanded the property deeds. He told Dad that he would burn the world down before he allowed a girl like me to inherit the land he believed was his birthright. Theodore looked at me with a serious expression and said, "These recordings provide a clear motive for the fire and will serve as the final nail in your brother's legal coffin." The evidence of his threats combined with the recent insurance fraud would be more than enough to trigger a full criminal investigation into the cause of the fire. I sat in that quiet office for a long time while the weight of my father's wisdom finally began to settle into my mind and bring me a sense of peace. He had spent his final days not just in fear, but in active preparation to ensure that justice would eventually be served to the person who betrayed him. I looked at the legal documents spread out before me and felt a renewed sense of strength that I had not felt since the tragedy began. Theodore promised me that we would present this evidence to the district attorney within the next 48 hours to begin the process of reclaiming my life. I realized that Silas had absolutely no idea that the sister he had insulted and the father he had threatened were now united against him in a way he could never defeat. The city outside was loud and chaotic, but inside that office the air felt clear and full of a cold, sharp determination to see this fight through to the bitter end. The final battle did not require fire or violence because it was decided by the cold and undeniable strength of forensic evidence within the county courthouse. I walked into the crowded conference room with Theodore Vance, just as Silas was preparing to sign a multi-million-dollar contract with the greedy real estate developers. My brother looked up with a smirk of absolute triumph until he saw the original blue leather folder containing the authentic will in the lawyer's steady hands. Theodore presented the document to the presiding judge while also providing a series of digital recordings that captured the terrifying threat Silas had made against our father's life. Silas completely collapsed in his chair as his entire web of lies and forged documents was exposed in front of the stunned courtroom spectators and law enforcement officials. The sheriff moved forward to arrest Silas for grand larceny and felony insurance fraud, while the developer's lawyers scrambled to distance themselves from the entire criminal scandal. I stood there feeling a sudden and profound sense of peace as my brother was led away in handcuffs to face a long and inevitable prison sentence for his crimes. Following the legal proceedings, I successfully reclaimed the entire Montgomery farm and dedicated my life to restoring the scorched earth of our family apple orchard. I established a permanent nature conservation trust in the name of Arthur Montgomery to ensure that his legacy of integrity would survive for future generations to enjoy. My new life is now defined by a sense of quiet freedom and a total severance of any emotional ties to the man who once called himself my brother. Before we conclude today's emotional story, let us take a moment to reflect on the deeper layers of this tragic family conflict that many of you might find incredibly relatable. Do not overlook the subtle but profound wisdom of the father, because Arthur Montgomery understood that blood relations do not always guarantee a person's loyalty or their fundamental character. This story serves as a stark reminder that greed has the terrifying power to incinerate even the most sacred bonds of family if it is left unchecked for too long. We must recognize that being proactive in protecting our legacy is a sign of true strength, rather than a simple lack of trust toward those we supposedly love. The most important lesson here is that justice can be slow and painful, but it will eventually arrive for those who are brave enough to stand for the truth. It is truly heartbreaking to see how some people can trade their humanity for a stack of paper, yet it is also inspiring to see the light of integrity prevail. If you were in Eleanor's position, would you have found the internal courage to pursue justice against your own sibling, or would you have walked away to avoid the emotional pain? Please share your personal thoughts and alternative perspectives in the comments section below, because your unique opinions truly enrich our community's understanding of these complex family situations. Thank you for listening until the very end and for supporting the difficult journey of